All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are plunging into another stack of sources sent to us by you, our curious listener. This particular stack is all about something that has really captured public attention and sparked a lot of discussion: alkaline water.
That's right. We have a fascinating collection of materials here. We're looking at excerpts from 4 distinct pieces of research and analysis that approach alkaline water from several different angles.
Yeah, it seems like it covers quite a bit.
It does. We have studies investigating its potential impact on human physiology during exercise recovery, explorations into its effects on molecular markers associated with aging. This one was in a mouse model, and even a look at its influence on things like inflammation, oxidative stress, and quality of life in individuals with type 2 diabetes.
And critically, nestled among these studies, we also have a scientific review article. This one doesn't just report findings, but takes a really sharp, critical look at the fundamental science behind many of the common claims made about alkaline water.
Exactly. It challenges some very popular ideas about why it might have any effects at all.
Which is always interesting territory for us.
Definitely. So our mission, as always in the deep dive, is to serve as your guides through this material. We're going to unpack what these specific sources say, distill the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight, compare and contrast where relevant,
and help you become truly well-informed on this topic, drawing only from the evidence presented in these pages. That's the key part, sticking to what's in front of us here.
Precisely.
Prepare for some surprising details, it sounds like. We're going to explore everything from how quickly your blood viscosity changes after a tough workout.
Yeah, that thickness of the blood.
To the tiny structures on your chromosomes called telomeres that are linked to aging.
Those little caps.
And even discuss how combining alkaline water with simple walking might create a synergistic effect for people managing type 2 diabetes.
The combination aspect is particularly interesting in the diabetes study.
And then we'll put it all into perspective with that review that really scrutinizes the underlying science. It's going to be quite the journey through this stack. Okay, let's get started and set the stage.
Let's do that. Before we dive into the specific studies, it's helpful to understand what these sources generally mean when they refer to alkaline water, and maybe define a few key scientific concepts that you'll encounter repeatedly in the material.
Sounds like a solid plan. So let's start at the beginning. What exactly is alkaline water in the context of these sources we have here?
Well, primarily, the studies in the review we have are discussing electrolyzed high pH water. You'll see it referred to using acronyms like ERW, which stands for electrolyzed reduced water.
ERW, okay.
Or sometimes just ALK, like in one of the studies focused on exercise.
And how is this electrolyzed water actually produced? Based on what the sources describe, how do they make it?
Okay, so according to the review article, which goes into some detail on this type of water is produced through a process called electrolysis.
Right, running electricity through water.
Basically, yes. You pass an electric current through water that contains some dissolved minerals or salts, which act as electrolytes. They help conduct the electricity.
Makes sense.
Inside the electrolysis device, there are typically 2 electrodes, a positive one called the anode, and a negative one, the cathode, often separated by a membrane.
Okay.
At the anode, the positive one, water molecules are essentially split, and hydrogen ions, H plus Ea, are generated. This makes the water around the anode more acidic.
So you get acid water there.
Exactly. And then at the cathode, the negative electrode, it's the opposite, hydroxyl ions, OH, are generated. This results in water with a higher concentration of OH ions, meaning a higher pH, making it alkaline.
Ah, so the process splits the water into 2 streams, one acidic and one alkaline.
Precisely. And the alkaline stream is what's typically being discussed or sold as alkaline water. Crucially, though, the review also notes that molecular hydrogen gas, H2, is also produced at that same negative electrode, the cathode, during this process.
Oh, interesting. So the alkaline water stream also contains dissolved hydrogen gas. That seems important.
It turns out to be very important, especially according to that review article. We'll definitely circle back to that H2.
Okay, so high pH water, made via electrolysis, often containing dissolved H2 gas. That's a working definition from these sources.
That's the gist of it. And it's worth mentioning, the review article later clarifies something about the term ionized water.
Yeah, what about it?
They point out it's actually a bit of a misnomer. Water molecules themselves, H2O, aren't becoming ions like H2O plus or H2O. It's not like the water molecule itself gains or loses an electron.
Ah, okay.
Instead, it's the concentration of the ions already naturally present in water, the hydrogen ions, H+, and hydroxide ions, that gets altered around the electrodes. This shift in their ratio changes the pH, but the water overall stays electrically neutral. It doesn't actually have more ions overall than the starting water, just a different balance between H plus and OH.
Got it. That's a useful clarification. So not really ionized in the common chemical sense, just shifted pH and with some dissolved H2. Okay. Now let's touch on some of those key concepts we'll see popping up. First one, featured prominently in one study, is blood viscosity.
Right, yeah. Basically the thickness or stickiness of your blood.
Why does that matter so much?
Yeah.
Especially in the context of exercise.
Well, the source focusing on this explains it pretty clearly. It highlights that dehydration losing body water significantly impairs physical performance.
We've probably all felt that.
Absolutely. The source even quantifies it, noting that losing 2% or more of your body mass just from sweating during exercise is consistently linked to impaired athletic performance.
2%. Doesn't sound like a huge amount, but it makes a difference.
Apparently so. And the source explains what's happening physiologically. Dehydration leads to cardiovascular strain. A key limiting factor for exercise performance, according to the source, is something called cardiovascular drift.
Cardiovascular drift, what's that?
It's where, during prolonged exercise, your heart rate gradually creeps up, while the amount of blood pumped with each beat that's your stroke volume decreases. Arterial pressure also tends to drop.
Oh.
And the source explicitly states that the extent of this drift correlates directly with how dehydrated you are. On top of that, dehydration increases systemic vascular resistance, meaning your blood vessels constrict, basically making it harder for blood to flow through the system. The heart has to work harder.
So, thicker blood, harder to pump blood, less efficient circulation overall.
Yeah, I can see why monitoring blood viscosity could be useful. Especially, they mention, at high shear rates.
Exactly. High shear rate viscosity is relevant during systole. It's the forceful contraction phase of the heart when blood is ejected. It reflects factors like the concentration of red blood cells, which is called hematocrit, and also how flexible or deformable those red blood cells are.
And low shear rate. Low shear rate viscosity is more related to diastole, the relaxation phase of the heartbeat. And it's influenced more by how much red blood cells tend to clump together or aggregate. The source suggests that the high shear systolic viscosity might be a more direct indicator of hydration status itself.
Okay, that clarifies why blood viscosity is a key player in that study. Next concept, oxidative stress. This pops up quite a bit, right?
It does, yeah. It appears in both the aging source and the type 2 diabetes source. Oxidative stress is generally described as an imbalance in the body. You get an excess of reactive oxygen species, or ROS.
ROS. Those are the unstable molecules, the free radicals we hear about.
Exactly, the ones that can damage cells if they're not kept in check. Our sources mention several specific markers they measure to try and gauge this stress. In the aging study, for instance, they looked at ROS levels directly.
Okay.
Plus, they measured the levels of the body's own natural antioxidant enzymes, like SOD1, that's superoxide dismutase 1, and GSH, which is glutathione.
So in that context, lower ROS and higher levels of SOD1 and GSH would be a good sign, indicating less oxidative stress and better antioxidant defense.
That's the general interpretation presented in that source, yes. Now, the diabetes study used slightly different markers for oxidative stress. They looked at AGEs, advanced glycation end products, and AOPPs, advanced oxidation protein products, and also MDA, malondialdehyde.
Okay, different acronyms, but same basic idea, markers of damage.
Pretty much. According to that source, high levels of these AGEs, AOPPs, and MDA are associated with cell damage and are particularly relevant to the complications seen in diabetes.
Got it. And that diabetes study also brought up inflammation, didn't it?
Yes, it did. Inflammation is noted in that source as another major feature of type 2 diabetes that really contributes to complications down the line.
And they measured specific markers for that too.
They did. They looked at the total white blood cell count, or WBCs, and also the neutrophil lymphocyte ratio, the NLR. Changes in these counts and ratios can give an indication of the level of systemic inflammation in the body.
Okay, inflammation markers. Moving on to something quite specific mentioned in the aging study, telomeres.
Ah, yes, telomeres. The source introduces these as protective structures located at the very ends of your chromosomes. Think of them like the little plastic tips on shoelaces.
Okay, caps on the chromosomes.
Exactly. And they're considered molecular markers related to aging. The source explains that, generally speaking, with each cell division, these telomere caps get a bit shorter.
Right, they wear down over time.
Kind of, yeah. But critically, there's an enzyme called telomerase that can help maintain or even lengthen telomeres. Low levels of this telomerase activity and consequently short telomeres are associated with reduced cell viability and are seen as indicators of cellular aging or senescence.
So shorter telomeres, more aging, longer telomeres, maybe less aging or delayed aging, at least at the cellular level.
That's the concept presented in this source. Interestingly, the source also mentions a prior study, one not provided in our stack, suggesting telomere length might be influenced by localized pH variations. Specifically, it mentions a finding where a low pH of 6.8 induced telomerase extension, but specifically of short telomeres in human telomerase. It's a bit complex, but the main takeaway from this source is the link between short telomeres, low telomerase, and aging.
Okay, got it. Telomeres as aging markers. Then we have quality of life,
Yeah.
QOL. This sounds less technical, more about how people feel.
It is, exactly.
Yeah.
In the diabetes study, QOL was measured using a standardized questionnaire called the SF-36.
SF-36, I think I've heard of that.
Yeah, it's a widely used tool. It basically asks a person how their health affects various aspects of their life, things like physical functioning, bodily pain, social functioning, mental health, energy levels, and so on.
Right.
The answers are then compiled into scores, often summarized into two main components: a physical component summary, PCS, and a mental component summary, MCS, along with an overall total QRL score. It really gives you the patient's reported perspective on their overall well-being.
Okay, a way to measure how people are actually experiencing their health. And finally, one more from the review article. Oxidation reduction potential, ORP.
Yes, ORP. The review discusses this as a measure often associated with electrolyzed reduced water, or ERW.
What does it measure exactly?
It's essentially a measure of the relative tendency of a substance, in this case, the water, to either accept electrons or donate electrons in a chemical reaction.
Okay.
A negative ORP value is often highlighted in marketing and sometimes in research. It's frequently claimed to indicate that the substance has antioxidant properties, meaning it has a readiness to donate electrons to neutralize those reactive oxygen species, the ROS we talked about.
So negative ORP is often presented as a sign of antioxidant power.
That's the common claim, yes. Though the review article will have quite a bit more to say about interpreting ORP later on.
All right, good setup. So we're equipped with the necessary concepts: blood thickness linked to hydration, the cellular stress and inflammation markers relevant to diabetes and aging, those chromosome caps tied to aging, patient-reported well-being, and this measure of electron transfer potential, ORP. With this vocabulary in hand, let's jump into our first deep dive into the actual research, starting with that viscosity study on exercise and hydration.
Okay, sounds good. This first source presents a study titled Effect of Electrolyzed High pH Alkaline Water on Blood Viscosity in Healthy Adults. Implications for exercise recovery.
Right.
And as the title suggests, it specifically investigates how drinking electrolyzed high pH alkaline water, compared to just standard purified water, affects blood viscosity in healthy adults while they're recovering from dehydration induced by exercise.
And as we touched on earlier, the rationale, the why behind this study is pretty straightforward based on this source. Dehydration really messes with exercise performance and recovery.
Absolutely. The source elaborates quite a bit on this. It states that impaired performance, increased cardiovascular strain, heat strain, and even altered neurological and metabolic function are all direct consequences of not having enough hydration during exercise.
Yeah.
They specifically highlight that 2% body mass loss threshold, again, lose that much or more through sweating, and you see significant performance impairment.
Right.
They also bring up that cardiovascular drift concept, again, the rising heart rate, falling stroke volume, calling it a primary limiting factor in prolonged exercise. And its magnitude is directly proportional to the level of dehydration.
So the more dehydrated you are, the worse the drift.
Exactly. And on top of that, dehydration increases systemic vascular resistance, those constricting blood vessels we mentioned, which elevates the pressure the heart has to pump against. And so yeah, exploring ways to improve rehydration efficiency after exercise makes a lot of sense, both for performance and just reducing physiological stress.
It paints a very clear picture of why effective rehydration is so critical. Okay, tell us about the study setup itself. Who participated? How did they run it?
This was designed as a randomized, double-blind, parallel-arm, controlled trial. Pretty standard, rigorous design.
Okay.
They enrolled 100 healthy, non-smoking adults. And to ensure good representation, they split the group equally, 50 men and 50 women.
Good sample size.
Yeah. Participants were between 25 and 49 years old, and they had a body mass index, BMI, less than or equal to 29, so generally a healthy adult population. They also had typical exclusion criteria to avoid things that could mess up the results, like being pregnant, breastfeeding, menstruating for the women, or using recent oral contraceptives or certain medications.
Standard stuff to keep the groups comparable. What about the actual water they tested?
They used two specific beverages. The test beverage, which they labeled ALK, was described as electrolyzed high pH water, and they specifically cited the brand Essentia.
Essentia, okay. And the control?
The control beverage, labeled San, was standard purified water with some minerals added just for taste. For this one, they specifically cited the brand Dasani.
Essentia versus Dasani. Interesting they named the brands. So how did the actual exercise and rehydration part work for the participants?
Right, the protocol. First, participants underwent an exercise session designed to make them dehydrated. The goal was to get them to lose at least 2% of their initial body mass through sweating.
Okay, exercise till you lose 2% body weight. Then what?
As soon as they hit that dehydration target, they stopped exercising and immediately entered a 30-minute rehydration period. This was followed right away by a 90-minute recovery period where they just rested.
So 30 minutes to drink, 90 minutes to rest. That's 120 minutes total post-exercise.
Exactly, a total of 2 hours starting from the beginning of rehydration. And the amount of water they had to drink during that first 30 minutes was very specific.
How specific?
It was calculated as 20 milliliters per 1 kilogram of their pre-exercise body weight. So if you weighed 70 kilos, you drink 1,400 milliliters, or 1.4 liters. This volume was chosen because it's equivalent to that 2% body mass they aimed to lose during exercise.
Ah, so they're trying to replace the fluid lost.
Pretty much, yeah. And they had to consume that entire prescribed volume within that initial 30-minute window.
Okay, so dehydrate by 2%, drink back roughly 2% of your body weight in the assigned water within half an hour, then just sit and recover for the next hour and a half.
That was the core procedure for every participant, yeah.
And what measurements were they taking during all this? What were they looking for?
The primary outcome measure, the main thing they were interested in, was whole blood viscosity, that WBV measured specifically at a high shear rate.
Right, the systolic viscosity we talked about, linked more directly to hydration.
Exactly. They reasoned this would be a good indicator of intravascular hydration status, influenced by things like hematocrit and red cell deformability during the heart's pumping phase.
Got it. That was the main target. Were there secondary measures too?
Yes. They also measured low shear WBV, plasma osmolality, which is another key indicator of hydration levels in the blood plasma, and they used bioimpedance analysis.
Bioimpedance, what's that measure?
It's a technique that estimates body composition, including body water distribution, by measuring how electrical currents flow through the body. They also tracked changes in body weight, of course, and recorded vital signs like blood pressure, heart rate, respiration rate, and body temperature.
A pretty comprehensive set of measures. When did they take these measurements?
Blood samples for the viscosity and osmolality were collected at specific time points during that 120-minute post-exercise period. They took samples at 15 minutes. Let's call that T015.
Okay.
And again at 30 minutes, T030, both within that initial rehydration window. Then they took a final blood sample at 120 minutes, T120, which marked the end of the 90-minute recovery phase.
So samples during drinking and at the very end.
Right. The bioimpedance measurements were taken at multiple points throughout the whole process, including during exercise and recovery. Body weight and vital signs were recorded at baseline, before exercise, immediately after exercise once they hit that 2% dehydration mark, let's call that T1000, and again at the end of the 120-minute recovery, T120.
Okay, that gives us a really clear picture of the experimental design. So what did the results actually show? Let's focus on that main measure, the high shear blood viscosity.
Okay, so the first finding was just confirming the setup worked. Both groups, the ALK group drinking Essentia and the Con group drinking Dasani, became similarly dehydrated during the exercise part. The source mentions the slopes of viscosity change from baseline to that T1000 point right after exercise were parallel between the groups.
Good. So they started the rehydration phase from a comparable level of dehydration. Makes the comparison fair.
Exactly. Then, during the rehydration and subsequent recovery period, so everything after T1000, this is where the key difference emerged. The study reported that the ALK group exhibited a significantly steeper negative slope for systolic blood viscosity compared to the Con group.
Okay. Steeper negative slope, let's unpack that. It means viscosity was decreasing, right? Moving back towards normal baseline levels.
Correct.
But the line on the graph representing the ALK group was dropping faster than the line for the con group.
That's precisely what it indicates, yes. The viscosity was reducing, meaning they were rehydrating effectively, but it happened at a faster rate in the group that drank the high pH alkaline water.
Wow, how much faster?
Well, the source highlights a specific time point, T060. That's 60 minutes after starting rehydration, so halfway through the total 120-minute recovery period. By this T060 mark, the mean systolic viscosity for subjects in the ALK group had already returned to their pre-exercise baseline levels.
Back to normal within an hour of starting to drink. What about the control group?
That's the contrast. The Con-N group, drinking the standard purified water, did not return to their baseline viscosity levels even by the very end of the study period at T120, 2 hours after starting rehydration.
Whoa. Okay, that's a pretty striking difference in the rate and, I guess, the completeness of viscosity recovery within that 2-hour window. The alkaline water group got back to baseline in an hour. The control group wasn't even there after 2 hours.
That's the key difference in the recovery trajectory reported in this study. Based on this, the study concluded there was indeed a significant difference in whole blood viscosity detected during the recovery phase when comparing the electrolyzed high pH electrolyte water, Essentia, to the standard purified water, Dasani.
Okay.
They further specified this by noting that ALK consumption reduced systolic blood viscosity significantly more than con consumption when they looked specifically at the percent change from the dehydrated state, T1000, to the end of recovery, T120.
So the overall improvement percentage-wise was greater in the ALK group.
Yes. And they mention using a mixed model statistical analysis, which is appropriate for handling repeated measurements over time like this, and it validated the significant treatment effect of the ALK water on systolic blood viscosity compared to the con water.
Okay, so the statistics back up the difference in the pattern of change over time and the overall percent change. But you mentioned something earlier about absolute differences. Was there a catch?
Not necessarily a catch, but an important nuance that the authors discussed in the source. While the rate of change, the slope, the percent change, and the overall treatment effect across time were statistically significant, they noted that the absolute differences in the viscosity measurements when compared at those individual time points, like T015, T030, T120, did not actually reach statistical significance.
Huh. How can that be? If the rate is different and the overall change is different.
The source speculates about this. They suggest that this lack in significance in the absolute values at specific snapshot moments, despite the clear difference in the rate of recovery and the overall validated effect, might be due to high subject-to-subject variability. Apparently, whole blood viscosity measurements can just be inherently quite variable between individuals.
Interesting. So the overall pattern of faster recovery is statistically real and supported, but if you just took a single photo at, say, the 30-minute mark, the difference between the groups might get lost in the noise of individual variation.
That seems to be the interpretation offered in the source, yeah. It highlights the importance of looking at the trend over time, not just isolated points.
Makes sense. What else did the source discuss regarding these findings? Did they offer explanations?
Well, they emphasize that blood viscosity clearly served as a valuable marker for tracking intravascular hydration and was definitely affected by the exercise-induced dehydration, which aligns with previous research in the field. They reiterated that blood viscosity isn't static, it changes with shear rate, explaining again the difference between high shear systolic relating to hematocrit and red cell flexibility and low shear diastolic relating more to red cell pumping or aggregation. And they reinforced their view that systolic WBV is likely a more direct hydration indicator.
Did they circle back to the difference between the waters themselves, the alkalinity?
They did. They noted that the primary known difference between the test water, Essentia, and the control water, Dasani, is the degree of alkalinity. In their discussion section, they briefly referenced a separate Japanese study, not this one, that had found a link between a diet high in acid load and increased cardiovascular risk factors like higher blood pressure, LDL cholesterol, total cholesterol, and BMI.
So they're suggesting a potential broader connection between the body's pH balance and cardiovascular health, maybe.
They mention it, yes, although they didn't directly connect that specific mechanism to the acute viscosity effect they observed in their own study. It was more context.
Okay. Do they speculate on any mechanism for their viscosity findings?
Yes, they did bring up oxidative stress in the discussion section. This is where they started connecting some potential dots, drawing on other research findings.
Oxidative stress again. How did they link it to viscosity?
They noted that disruptions in blood flow patterns, like what might happen when viscosity increases or circulation is impaired, can actually promote an oxidative state in the body. They explained that red blood cells are particularly vulnerable to oxidative stress and can even start producing free radicals themselves under such conditions.
Okay.
And here's the key link. Oxidative stress, they stated, is known to negatively impact red blood cells. It can make them more rigid, reducing their deformability, their ability to squeeze through tiny capillaries, and it can also increase their tendency to aggregate or clump together.
And both rigidity and clumping would increase blood viscosity, right?
Right. Exactly, which could then further impair blood flow. So the source seems to suggest a potential negative feedback loop or maybe a vicious cycle.
Like dehydration increases viscosity, impaired flow potentially increases oxidative stress. Oxidative stress damages red cells, making them rigid and sticky, which further increases viscosity and impairs flow even more.
That seems to be the pathway they're outlining, yeah. They supported this by citing other research that found associations between markers of oxidative stress in red blood cells. They mentioned glutathione, methemoglobin, and MDA again, and elevated whole blood viscosity in various populations, including healthy people and those with prediabetes or diabetes.
Okay, so based on all that, what was their speculation about their own result?
Based on this link between oxidative stress and red cell properties affecting viscosity, the authors speculate, and they frame it as speculation, that differences they observed in systolic viscosity recovery between the ALK and CON groups might be related to differential effects on oxidative stress.
Meaning the alkaline water might have somehow lessened the oxidative stress impact on red blood cells during rehydration.
That's the implication. Perhaps by protecting red cells or helping them recover function faster, which in turn allowed viscosity to normalize more quickly. It's presented as a potential explanation worth considering.
That's a really interesting potential mechanism linking back to oxidative stress. Before we move on from this study, what did the source say about safety and funding? Any issues?
On safety, the source explicitly states that no adverse events of any kind occurred during the study, so it seemed well tolerated.
Good. And funding. Conflicts of interest.
Regarding funding, the study was supported by a research grant from Essentia Water.
Ah, the company that makes the ALK water tested.
Correct. The source also notes the water-tested Essentia was provided by the company. Furthermore, some of the authors disclosed competing interests. They stated they received consulting fees and stock options from both Essentia Water and another company called RioVector. One author also received a fee for editing services related to the manuscript.
Okay, that's definitely important context to be aware of when interpreting the results. Standard practice to disclose, but good to know.
Absolutely.
So to quickly summarize this first source then, it provides evidence from a randomized controlled trial suggesting that drinking a specific brand of electrolyzed high pH electrolyte water, Essentia, leads to a significantly faster rate of blood viscosity recovery back towards baseline after exercise-induced dehydration compared to standard purified water, Dasani. Although absolute differences at specific time points weren't significant, the overall pattern was. And the authors speculate that differences in managing oxidative stress impacting red blood cells could potentially play a role in this observed effect.
That captures it well. Now shall we transition to our second source? This one takes us into a completely different realm, exploring the effects of alkaline water on markers related to aging and antioxidant defense, this time using a mouse model.
Okay, mice and aging. This study is titled In Vivo Anti-Aging Effects of Alkaline Water Supplementation. Wow, that title itself is pretty provocative. Anti-aging effects.
It certainly is. This source explores the potential of daily alkaline water supplementation. We'll need to look closely at what that involved to influence molecular markers of aging and enhance the body's antioxidant responses. And they did this in mice specifically bred or aged to model the aging process.
What's the rationale presented in this source? Why study alkaline water in the context of aging? What's the connection they make?
The source starts by emphasizing something fundamental. Water is essential for health. It then notes that aging is often associated with a decrease in total body water percentage.
Right, older people can get dehydrated more easily.
Exactly. And this can be made worse by reduced water intake, which they say is common in elderly individuals, so there's a basic hydration link. Then they connect two key molecular concepts to aging and age-related diseases like cancer. Those telomeres and the enzyme telomerase we defined earlier.
The chromosome caps and the enzyme that maintains them.
Right. They reiterate that telomeres generally shorten with cell division, and low telomerase activity leads to short telomeres, which is linked to cellular aging.
Did they mention that pH link again here?
Yes, briefly. Similar to what we discussed before, the source references that prior studies suggesting telomere length might be influenced by local pH, specifically mentioning that low pH, 6.8, induced telomerase extension of short telomeres in human telomerase. However, the main framing here focuses on aging being associated with telomere shortening due to low levels of telomerase activity. And crucially, besides telomeres, the source clearly identifies oxidative stress as another well-established contributor to the aging process, highlighting the role of those reactive oxygen species, ROS, in causing cellular damage over time.
Okay, so the why is rooted in these ideas. Aging involves potential dehydration, telomere shortening possibly linked to low telomerase, and definitely oxidative stress. And the question is, can alkaline water influence any of these factors?
That seems to be the core question driving this research.
All right, tell us about the mouse study setup. How did they do it?
This was conducted as an in vivo study, meaning in living organisms, using a mouse model designed to exhibit characteristics of aging. The specific strain of mouse wasn't detailed in the excerpt we have, but it was a model for aging.
Okay.
They divided these mice into two groups. One called the alkaline water supplementation group, or AWS, and the other was the control group, CTR.
AWS and CTR. And the intervention?
The core intervention was simply providing the mice with their assigned type of water daily over a pretty substantial period, 10 months.
10 months. That's a really long time in the lifespan of a mouse.
Mm-hmm.
So they were definitely looking for longer-term effects.
Seems so, yes.
Now, you flagged something critical earlier from this source's description. Was the alkaline water they used just standard electrolyzed water like in the first study?
No, and this is a very, very important distinction based on how the source describes the AWS water. It was not just plain high pH water from electrolysis.
What was it then?
It was described as water supplemented with a series of essential elements, and the source actually provides specific details about these additions.
Oh, really? Like what?
It contained boron B at 50 micrograms per 250 milliliters of water, molybdenum, Mo, at 2 micrograms per 250 milliliters, and selenium, say, at 5 micrograms per 250 milliliters.
So specific added minerals or trace elements?
Yes. And on top of those, it also contains specific salts. Sodium chloride, NaCl, sodium Na, calcium Ka, magnesium Mg, and potassium K. And get this, they even explicitly stated the source of these salts.
What were the sources?
They named Bolivian Rosa Andes mountain salt, Natural Alps mountain salt, and halate salt.
Wow. Okay, so this is definitely not just alkaline water. It's alkaline water supplementation that includes specific trace elements and these specific mineral salts from named, perhaps exotic sources. That's a huge detail for interpreting the result.
Absolutely crucial. This is a complex intervention, not just high pH water.
Definitely. Okay, so these mice drank either this special supplemented water, AWS, or regular water, CTR, for 10 months. What did the researchers measure afterwards?
After the 10-month period, they collected samples from the mice to assess those molecular markers they were interested in related to aging and antioxidants. From blood plasma, they measured the levels of ROS, reactive oxygen species.
The bad guys.
Right. And the levels of the antioxidant enzymes, SOD1 and GSH.
The good guys.
Exactly. They also measured telomerase activity in the blood plasma. Then they went further and harvested bone marrow and ovaries from the mice.
Why those tissues?
Bone marrow is critical for producing new blood cells, and ovaries are key for reproduction and fertility. Both systems are known to be affected by aging. In these tissues, they analyzed telomeres length and also something called cellularity.
Cellularity, just the number of cells.
Essentially, yeah. A measure of how densely populated with cells the tissue is, which can reflect tissue health and regenerative capacity.
Okay, so ROS, antioxidants, telomerase activity in blood, telomere length and cell density in bone marrow and ovaries. A comprehensive set of markers. What were the crucial findings reported from these measurements after the 10 months?
The findings related to the antioxidants were quite striking, according to the source. The AWS group, the mice getting the supplemented alkaline water, showed significantly reduced levels of ROS in their blood plasma compared to the control group.
Less oxidative damage marker. Good.
And at the same time, they had significantly increased levels of those natural antioxidants, GSH and SOD1, in their plasma compared to the control mice.
More antioxidant defense. Also good. So, based on these markers, the supplemented water seemed to reduce oxidative stress and boost the mice's own antioxidant systems.
That's what the data presented in this source suggests, yes.
Okay, what about the aging markers? The telomeres and telomerase.
Here, too, the AWS mice showed significant differences. They exhibited increased telomerase activity in their blood.
More of the enzyme that maintains telomeres.
Right. And consistent with that, they also found increased telomeres length in both the bone marrow and the ovaries of the AWS mice compared to the control mice.
Whoa. Increased telomere length. That's usually seen as a marker counteracting aging, right? Based on how they framed it.
That's certainly the implication drawn from the results presented here, yes. Finding increased length and increased activity of the enzyme that builds them aligns with the source's framing of telomeres as key aging markers, suggesting a potential effect on delaying cellular aging processes, at least based on these specific markers in these specific tissues in these mice.
That's pretty remarkable if true.
Yeah.
What about the cellularity finding?
That was also significant. The AWS mice also showed increased cellularity, meaning more cells or greater cell density in both their bone marrow and their ovaries compared to the control group.
Increased cellularity in bone marrow and ovaries?
Yeah.
That seems potentially significant for blood production and fertility, like you said, potentially broad effect. What did the authors discuss about these findings? Did they offer explanations?
They did have some discussion points. They noted that their findings on the increased antioxidant levels, SOD1 and GSH, were consistent with observations from a previous study, again, one not provided to us, which had suggested that alkaline water had a kind of sparing effect on antioxidant enzymes like SOD.
Sparing effect.
The idea, as presented, is that maybe the water helps deal with some oxidative stress directly, which spares the body's own enzymes, leaving them more available or at higher levels to neutralize free radicals.
Okay, interesting concept. Did they specifically address the fact that their alkaline water was heavily supplemented? Did they think the supplements mattered?
Yes, they absolutely did acknowledge this. The authors explicitly suggested that the specific essential elements they added to the AWS water, the boron, molybdenum, and selenium, may have contributed to the effects they observed.
So they admit the supplements could be responsible, at least in part.
Yes. However, they also tried to balance this by referencing yet another prior paper, also not provided, where apparently just water alkalinization alone without these specific supplements was reported to improve survival in a strain of long-lived mice. So they seem to be implying that maybe the alkalinity itself also plays a role independent of the specific supplements used in this particular study.
Okay. So maybe supplements help. Maybe alkalinity helps, maybe both. It's a bit unclear from their discussion based on other papers we don't have. Did they speculate on any other potential mechanisms?
They threw out a couple of other ideas. One was about gut health. They proposed that maybe controlling gut pH balance could reduce bacterial overgrowth, which might indirectly impact systemic inflammation or oxidative stress.
Okay, the gut microbiome angle.
Right. Another mechanism they discussed relates to the body's natural buffering system. They noted that water, maybe especially alkaline water, might support the natural production of bicarbonate, HCO3, which is a key buffer in our blood and tissues.
How do they connect that to aging?
They link this buffering idea to the concept that tissue acidification might underlie age-related osteoporosis, particularly in women. They mentioned a clinical study, not theirs, showing that giving potassium bicarbonate supplements induced bone remineralization in postmenopausal women. This suggests a potential role for systemic alkalinity or buffering capacity in bone health, although that's a bit separate from their main findings on telomeres and antioxidants.
Okay, so they're exploring a few different potential pathways. Antioxidant effects, possibly aided by supplements, maybe gut health, maybe buffering capacity, affecting things like bone health, drawing connections from other research. What were the overall conclusions the authors of this mouse study drew from their own work? What was their bottom line?
Well, the conclusions drawn in the source, based on their findings in this specific mouse model with this specific supplemented water, are quite strong, even bold.
How so?
They stated that the daily intake of their supplemented alkaline water, AWS, led to a systemic antioxidant effect, evidenced by the reduced ROS and increased SOD1 and GSH. They also concluded it increased telomerase activity and telomere length, which they explicitly interpreted as suggesting a delayed aging effect.
Delayed aging. That's a big claim from a mouse study.
It is. Additionally, they highlighted the increased cellularity in bone marrow and ovaries as a significant finding, and then they went on to speculate quite broadly.
Speculate about what?
They speculated that these phenomena, they observed the antioxidant effects, the telomere maintenance, the increased cellularity might potentially contribute to reducing aging-related tumors, possibly prolonging fertility, and potentially prolonging and improving the overall quality of life,
Wow.
simply by drinking a substantial amount of alkaline water. That's a direct quote on the potential implication.
That's a massive leap from mouse markers to human lifespan and disease prevention, especially given the supplemented nature of the water.
Did the source mention anything about ethical approval for the animal research?
Yes, it did. The source stated that the study protocols were approved by an ethical committee and that they followed Italian law regarding animal experimentation. Okay, so to recap the second source, a mouse study using a specially supplemented alkaline water found, after 10 months, improvements in antioxidant levels, less ROS, more SODGSH, increased telomerase activity, increased telomere length in bone marrow ovaries, and increased cellularity in those tissues compared to controls. The authors interpret these findings as suggesting delayed aging and speculate about major potential benefits like reducing tumors and prolonging life, while acknowledging the supplements may have played a role, but also referencing other work suggesting alkalinity alone might have effects. Key caveats. It's a mouse model, the water was heavily supplemented, and the conclusions drawn are quite speculative. Expert speaker. There's a very accurate summary, hitting all the key findings and crucial caveats from this particular source. Now, shall we shift gears again? Let's move to our third source, which brings us back to humans specifically. A trial looking at the effects of alkaline electrolyzed water and exercise on people with type 2 diabetes. Okay, back to humans. This study is titled Synergistic Effects of Regular Walking and Alkaline Electrolyzed Water Supplementation on Inflammation, Oxidative Stress, and Quality of Life in Patients with Type 2 Diabetes mellitus. The title emphasizes synergistic effects in supplementation again.
It does. This source presents a community-based randomized controlled trial, or RCP, that was conducted in Indonesia, and it was specifically designed to investigate not just the independent effects of drinking alkaline electrolyzed water, AEW, and doing regular walking, but also the potential synergistic effects of combining these two interventions in patients already diagnosed with type 2 diabetes mellitus, T2DM.
Okay, so looking at water alone, walking alone, and water plus walking compared to doing nothing. What was the rationale behind studying this specific combination in people with diabetes, according to the source? Why did they think this was important?
The source explains that oxidative stress and chronic inflammation are really well-established major features of type 2 diabetes.
Right, we hear that a lot.
And these processes are known to contribute significantly to the development and progression of diabetic complications, things like nerve damage, kidney problems, eye disease, which can severely impact a patient's health and their quality of life.
Makes sense.
The source then notes that both consuming alkaline electrolyzed water, AEW, and engaging in regular physical activity, like walking, have been independently suggested or recommended as strategies that might help reduce oxidative stress and inflammation.
So both things are thought to target the same underlying problems.
Exactly. So given this, the researchers hypothesized that combining the AEW intake with regular walking might actually produce a greater benefit, possibly a synergistic one, on these key factors, oxidative stress, inflammation in diabetic patients, compared to doing either thing alone or doing nothing. They also pointed out the practicality of studying these kinds of lifestyle interventions within a community setting, making the findings potentially more applicable in the real world.
Yeah, that makes sense. If both are thought to help individually via similar pathways, maybe combining them gives you a bigger bang for your buck. Tell us about this study setup and the participants. Who was involved?
This was designed as a single-blind, community-based RCT. Single-blind likely means the participants knew which group they were in, but maybe the researchers assessing outcomes were blinded, though it's mainly specified analysts were blinded later.
Okay.
They recruited 81 patients who had been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes mellitus. They spanned a fairly wide age range, from 18 to 75 years old. All participants had a confirmed physician diagnosis based on standard criteria like high fasting blood glucose or high glucose after a meal, 200 mg/dL. And importantly, they were all on stable oral hypoglycemic agents, meaning their diabetes pills weren't changing during the study period.
So they were already being treated, but maybe not optimally controlled.
That's likely the case, yes. They had several exclusion criteria, too, to ensure the groups were suitable. Things like having previously used alkaline electrolyzed water, being unable to walk, being pregnant, having other serious chronic or acute diseases that might interfere, or being on insulin therapy. They only included those on pills.
Okay, fairly standard recruitment for a T2DM trial. How are they divided up?
The 81 enrolled participants were randomly allocated into one of 4 different groups for an intervention period that lasted 8 weeks.
4 groups, 8 weeks. What were the specific interventions for each group?
Okay, the 4 groups were: Group 1 was the AEW group. These participants were instructed to consume 2 liters per day of alkaline electrolyzed water.
2 liters a day. That's quite a bit.
It is a substantial amount, yes. Group 2 was the walking group. These participants were instructed to engage in regular walking for a total of 150 minutes per week.
150 minutes a week. That's the standard recommendation, right? Like 30 minutes, 5 days a week.
Exactly. The discussion section of the source implies it was often done that way, at a moderate intensity. Group 3 was the combined group. As the name suggests, this group got both interventions. They consumed 2 liters of AEW per day, and they walked for 150 minutes per week.
Okay, the combo group and the last one.
Group 4 was the control group. Participants in this group were simply asked to continue their usual habitual diet and their normal physical activity levels without any specific intervention from the study.
All right, the comparison group doing nothing new.
Yeah.
So a standard forearm design, water only, water plus walking, and control. What specific measurements did they take? You mentioned inflammation, oxidative stress, QOL. When did they measure these?
They took measurements at 2 time points. At baseline, before the 8-week intervention started, and then again right after the 8-week intervention period ended.
Okay, before and after, what did they measure?
At the beginning, they collected baseline characteristics, demographics, dietary habits, and they also assessed psychological factors like stress, anxiety, and depression levels using standard questionnaires.
Okay, good background info. And the main outcome measures?
The main outcomes measured at both baseline and 8 weeks were that panel of biochemical markers and the quality of life score. For the biochemical markers they measured, those oxidative stress markers we discussed, AGEs, AOPPs, and MDA. Remember, higher levels generally mean more oxidative damage. The inflammation markers, white blood cell count, WBCs, and the neutrophil lymphocyte ratio, NLR. Higher values typically indicate more inflammation. And for glycemic control, fasting blood glucose, FBG levels. Lower is better here, generally.
Got it. Oxidative stress, inflammation, blood sugar, and quality of life.
For quality of life, they use that SF36 questionnaire again. They assess the physical component summary, PCS, the mental component summary, MCS, and the overall total QOL score. Higher scores mean better quality of life.
Okay. Did they mention blinding?
Yes, the source specifically stated that the phlebotomists who drew the blood samples and the biochemical analysts who processed those samples were blinded to which group the participants belonged to.
That's good. It helps reduce potential bias in the measurements and analysis. Okay. Comprehensive set of markers covering the key areas: oxidative stress, inflammation, blood sugar control, and, importantly, how the patients actually felt about their health. So the crucial part: what did the study find after these 8 weeks of intervention?
Okay, first off, they reported that the baseline data showed the 4 groups were pretty similar at the start in terms of their demographics, clinical characteristics, and the initial levels of all the markers they measured.
Good. Randomization worked. The groups were comparable starting out.
Exactly, which is crucial for a valid comparison. Now, looking at the changes within each group from their own baseline to the end of the 8 weeks, they observed some really interesting patterns.
Like what?
Well, perhaps most striking was the control group. The group that just continued their usual routine actually showed statistically significant increases in all the measured inflammatory and oxidative stress markers over the 8 weeks.
Increases, so they got worse.
According to the within-group analysis, yes. Their AGs, AOPPs, MDA, WBC counts, and NLR all went up significantly during that 8-week period. Interestingly, their fasting blood glucose, FBG, did not change significantly within the group. Just the inflammation and oxidative stress markers seemed to worsen.
Wow. So for these patients with T2DM, just carrying on as usual seemed to correlate with a worsening biochemical profile in terms of oxidative stress and inflammation over just 2 months. That's sobering.
It is rather striking, yes. That's what the data for the control group indicated in this study.
Okay, what about the intervention groups? Did they fare better?
Yes, quite the opposite picture. All 3 intervention groups, the AEW group, water only, the walking group, exercise only, and the combined group, water plus exercise, all showed statistically significant reductions in AGs, AOPPs, MDA, FBG, and WBC counts after 8 weeks compared to their own baseline values. They also all showed a significantly lower NLR, neutrophil lymphocyte ratio, at the end.
Okay, so any of the interventions, water alone, walking alone, or the combination, led to significant improvements in oxidative stress markers, inflammation markers, and fasting blood glucose compared to where they started. That's positive.
Very positive findings from the within-group analysis for all 3 intervention arms, yes.
What about their quality of life scores? Did those improve too?
Yes, they did. All 3 intervention groups also showed significant increases in their overall quality of life scores after 8 weeks compared to their own baseline.
All 3?
Yes. Diving a bit deeper into the components, the walking group and the combined group showed significant increases in all 3 SF-36 scores: the physical component, PCS, the mental component, MCS, and the total QOL score.
Okay, walking seemed to boost both physical and mental aspects. What about the water-only group?
The AEW group also showed significant increases in the physical component score, PCS, and the total QL score compared to their baseline. However, the increase they saw in the mental component score, MCS, was not statistically significant in this particular within-group analysis.
Huh. That's interesting. So, based on comparing people to their own starting point, the physical aspect of QOL and the overall QL seemed to improve with just the water. But the mental health component seemed to significantly improve only when walking was part of the picture, either alone or combined with water.
That's what the within-group QOL data suggests, yes. An interesting distinction there.
Definitely. Okay, so within-group changes show the interventions helped and the control group maybe worsened.
Yeah.
But you said that the authors really emphasized the between-group comparisons, comparing the intervention effects to the control group.
Exactly. That's where they really highlighted the impact, especially for the synergy idea. They performed analyses comparing the changes in each intervention group to the changes in the control group after adjusting for any small differences at baseline.
Right, the crucial comparison. How much better did they do than doing nothing?
Precisely, and the results were quite clear. Compared to the control group, the AEW group, water only, showed statistically significant reductions in all 6 biochemical markers they measured.
All 6. So AOPPs, AGEs, MDA, FBG, NLR, and WBCs. All significantly better than control just by drinking the water.
That's what the adjusted analysis showed, yes. Significant improvements across the board on the biochemical front compared to control. The AEW group also demonstrated a significant increase in the SF-36 PCS, physical QOL, and the SF-36 total QOL scores compared to the control group.
Okay, so drinking the alkaline water alone resulted in clear, broad biochemical improvements and better physical and overall quality of life compared to the control group over 8 weeks.
It did, according to this analysis. Now, the walking group also showed similarly significant reductions in all 6 biochemical markers compared to the control group.
Same biochemical benefits as the water group, then?
Yes. And interestingly, the walking group showed significant increases in all 3 quality of life scores, SF-36 PCS, SF-36 MCS, and SF-36 total QOL when compared to the control group.
So walking alone hit all the QOL markers significantly compared to control, including the mental component, reinforcing that earlier finding.
Exactly. It really seemed to provide broad benefits on its own compared to the control group.
Okay, so both interventions alone showed clear and broad benefits over the control group. Now, the big question, what about the combined group? Was the effect just additive, or was it truly synergistic?
This is where the authors really emphasize the synergistic effect, as mentioned in the title. The combined group, the ones drinking the AEW and doing the walking, demonstrated the most significant reductions across all 6 biochemical markers, AOPPs, AGs, MDA, FBG, NLR, and WBCs, when compared to the control group.
The most significant, meaning the magnitude of the improvement was statistically larger than in the water-only or walking-only groups compared to control.
The source implies this by using terms like most significant and synergistic amelioration. They state the combined group showed the greatest improvement. Furthermore, the combined group also showed the most significant increases in all 3 quality of life scores, SF-36 PCS, SF-36 MCS, and SF-36 total QOL compared to the control group.
Wow. So hitting all markers, biochemical and QOL, with the biggest improvements seen when combining the water and the walking.
That's exactly what the source reports. The authors explicitly state in their conclusion that this combined intervention group exhibited synergistic amelioration of these key diabetes-related factors.
And synergistic, just to be clear, implies the combined effect was more than just adding the benefit of water to the benefit of walking. It was somehow amplified.
That is the definition of synergy, yes. The effect is greater than the sum of its parts. And the author's language in the source strongly highlights this finding, suggesting that the combination provided a uniquely powerful benefit on these specific markers and quality of life in this diabetic population over the relatively short 8-week period.
That's a really compelling finding if it holds up. What did the authors discuss as the potential reasons behind these results, especially that powerful synergistic effect?
They spent some time discussing this. First, they noted that their results regarding the independent benefits of walking are very consistent with previous research. Many studies have shown that exercise, even just moderate walking, can effectively reduce inflammatory markers, lower oxidative stress markers, and improve glycemic control, blood sugar, in patients with T2DM.
Right. Exercise is well-known medicine for diabetes.
Exactly. They explained how walking might do this. For instance, walking alone can increase the activity of the body's own natural antioxidant enzymes. Exercise also improves glycemic control primarily by reducing insulin resistance, which means the body's cells respond better to insulin. This better response reduces high blood sugar levels, hyperglycemia, which in turn reduces the formation of those damaging AGEs and AOPPs markers that are largely caused by excess sugar sticking to proteins and fats.
Okay, so exercise works on insulin sensitivity and boosts antioxidant defenses.
Right. And the observed improvement in quality of life with walking was also consistent with other research. They noted that regular exercise is a strong predictor of improvements in both the physical and mental components of QOL.
Okay, that explains the walking benefits.
Yeah.
What about the water, and specifically the combined effect? How do they explain the synergy?
They attributed the combined effect primarily to synergistic antioxidant effects.
Ah, back to antioxidants again.
Yes. They proposed that the alkaline electrolyzed water, AAW, works by increasing the body's overall antioxidant defense capacity while simultaneously helping to reduce the actual production of oxidants, like ROS.
So AEW boosts defense and lowers offense on the antioxidant front.
That's the idea they put forward. They also suggested that AEW might have beneficial effects specifically on exercise recovery, maybe due to its potential free radical scavenging properties. This could help maintain muscle performance and overall redox homeostasis.
Redox homeostasis.
Basically, maintaining that healthy balance between oxidants and antioxidants in the body, especially during and after the stress of physical activity.
Okay. And this is where they explicitly connected back to the findings of that first study we discussed, the viscosity study. They mentioned that AEW was shown in that study to help restore rehydration and reduce blood viscosity after exercise. And they recalled the point made in that study's discussion that disruptions in blood viscosity and flow are known to promote oxidative stress.
Ah, so they're tying it together. Maybe the water helps with exercise recovery, less viscosity, better flow, which reduces exercise-induced oxidative stress. A and D, the water itself has antioxidant properties.
That seems to be the connection they're drawing. So their overall theory for the synergy is this. Both walking and AEW contribute to reducing oxidative stress, but maybe through slightly different or complementary mechanisms. Walking boosts the body's internal antioxidant enzymes and improves insulin sensitivity. AEW provides its own antioxidant effect, maybe via H2, though they don't specify that here, and potentially improves exercise recovery blood flow. When you combine these two approaches, these antioxidant effects might multiply or enhance each other, leading to even better control of blood glucose and inflammatory markers.
Exactly. Which, in turn, would diminish the progression of diabetic complications and significantly optimize the patient's quality of life, hitting both the physical and mental aspects strongly, as observed in the combined group.
That's a plausible proposed mechanism for the synergy they observed. What was their final conclusion from this T2DM study?
They concluded this study by stating that regular walking and drinking AEW, both when used independently and especially when used synergistically together, led to significant improvements in fasting blood glucose, markers of oxidative stress and inflammation, and quality of life in these patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus over the 8-week intervention period. They suggested this combined approach could be a feasible and effective treatment strategy.
Feasible because walking and drinking water are relatively accessible interventions.
Precisely. Low cost, potentially high benefit.
And the funding for this particular study? Any conflicts mentioned?
The source states this study was funded by grants from the Ministry of Science and Technology in Taiwan. The authors reported having no conflict of interest related to this work.
Okay, good to know. So we've now explored 3 sources that, using quite different approaches, a human trial on hydration and viscosity, a mouse model looking at aging markers, and this human trial on diabetes, inflammation, and QOL, all present findings suggesting potential positive effects associated with consuming alkaline water, sometimes with specific additions like in the mouse study, or in combination with exercise like in the diabetes study.
That's correct. We have these three pieces suggesting what might happen. And now we pivot to our fourth source, which is that scientific review article. This piece, remember, doesn't report on a specific new experiment, but instead critically examines the existing scientific claims and the proposed mechanisms behind any reported effects of electrolyzed reduced water, ERW, which is that common term for alkaline ionized water.
Right. This sounds like the source that might provide a very different perspective, maybe explaining why or even if these effects are really due to what people think.
Precisely. This review article, published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, the source is cited as Isaac Ines 23 1x750-v2.pdf, really delves into the history of ERW, analyzes the popular claims often made about its health benefits, and then presents what the authors argue is the current, accurate scientific understanding of what's actually going on at a molecular level.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is the core argument or the central thesis of this review article? What's their main point?
Their central argument is quite direct and, frankly, critical of many common claims. They contend that for many years, the purported benefits of ERW were often linked to concepts that were vague, sometimes mystical, or just lacked scientific plausibility terms the authors themselves categorize as pseudoscience.
Strong words.
Yes. The review then strongly argues that the observed therapeutic effects, sometimes reported for ERW, as well as its characteristic negative ORP, oxidation reduction potential, are not actually due to its alkalinity, the high pH, or any of these other popular but scientifically questionable claims.
Okay, so if it's not the pH or the other stuff, what do they say is responsible?
They argue, very forcefully, that these effects are exclusively attributable to the molecular hydrogen H2 gas, that tiny H2 molecule which is produced and dissolved into the water during the electrolysis process, specifically at the cathode, the negative electrode where the alkaline water forms.
Wow. So they're making a very clear case. Forget the pH, forget the other claims. If there's a real benefit, it's only because of the dissolved hydrogen gas.
That is the absolute core of their argument. And they build this case throughout the review by systematically examining and, in their view, debunking the most common claims made about ERW. They start by reiterating how ERW is made through electrolysis, separating water into acidic water at the anode and alkaline water at the cathode, where H2 gas is also produced.
And they mentioned earlier that the term ionized water is a misnomer.
Yes, and they elaborate on that point again here. They explain that the term ionized water is scientifically inaccurate in this context because the water molecules, H2O themselves, are not being ionized into charged H2O plus or H2O ions. Instead, the electrolysis process just alters the ratio and concentration of the hydrogen ions, H+, and hydroxide ions that are already naturally present in water, doing so differently at the two electrodes. This shift in ratio is what leads to the pH difference, but the overall solution remains electrically neutral. The water doesn't contain more ions than the original water, it just has that different balance between H+ and OH.
Okay, that reinforces the point about the terminology being potentially misleading. Let's get into their systematic debunking of the common claims. What's the first big claim they address?
Claim 1. The alkaline pH itself provides health benefits by alkalizing the body. This is probably the most widespread claim, as you noted. The idea that drinking high pH water can counteract acidity in the body and improve health.
Right. What is the review's scientific counterargument against this very popular idea?
They state, quite unequivocally, that the pH of healthy human blood is very tightly regulated by powerful buffer systems in the body, primarily the bicarbonate buffer system in the blood. This system keeps blood pH within a very narrow, slightly alkaline range, typically 7.35 to 7.45.
Our body fights hard to keep that balance.
Extremely hard. And while it's true that various disease states can cause dangerous shifts in blood pH, like metabolic acidosis or alkalosis, the review argues that drinking ERW, or any alkaline water for that matter, will not meaningfully change your systemic blood pH.
Okay, why not? If you're drinking something with a high pH, shouldn't it have some effect?
According to the review, the reason is because ERW has a very, very low buffering capacity.
Low buffering capacity, what does that mean?
It means that while the water might register a high pH number on a meter, say 9.5 or 10, it lacks the chemical components, the actual buffering agents that would allow it to resist changes in pH when it encounters acids, like the strong acid in your stomach or metabolic acids produced in the body. A true buffer solution can absorb added acid or base without its pH changing much. ERW, they argue, can't do that effectively.
So it has a high pH score, but it's easily knocked down.
Exactly. They use an analogy or refer to common demonstrations to illustrate this. They mention how adding just a few drops of acidic soda can drastically lower the pH of a glass of alkaline water. They argue this doesn't show the power of the alkaline water, it just shows the acidity of the soda and the weakness of the alkaline water's ability to resist that acid.
All right.
To really drive this point home with numbers, they offer a striking comparison. They state that just 1 teaspoon, about 9 grams of common baking soda, sodium bicarbonate, which is a well-known buffer, and has a pH of only about 8.1 when dissolved in water. That 1 teaspoon of baking soda has the capacity to neutralize as much acid as approximately 1,800 liters of typical pH 9.5 alkaline water.
1,800 liters.
Yeah.
For 1 teaspoon of baking soda.
That's the calculation they present. It really puts the concept of buffering capacity into perspective. So the argument is, despite the high pH number, ERW just doesn't have the chemical muscle to significantly neutralize acid in the body compared to the body's own powerful systems or even common substances like baking soda.
That's a very compelling argument against the alkalizing the body claim based on pH alone. Does the review say anything about naturally alkaline water?
Yes, they do touch on that. They concede that naturally alkaline spring water, which gets its higher pH from dissolved minerals picked up from rocks like calcium, magnesium bicarbonate, might have health benefits. But they argue if it does, it's likely due to the high content of those dissolved alkaline minerals, calcium, magnesium, etc., which are bioavailable and are essential nutrients for the body. It's the minerals doing the work, they suggest, not the high pH itself.
So the benefit comes from the mineral content in natural alkaline water, not the pH number.
That's their argument. They even suggest that the minerals potentially present in electrolyzed water, ERW, might actually be less bioavailable compared to those in naturally alkaline water. Why? Because the high pH environment created during electrolysis can actually reduce the solubility of some important minerals like calcium and magnesium, potentially making them harder for the body to absorb.
Interesting twist. Okay, so Claim 1, alkalizing the body via pH, seems strongly refuted by this review based on physiology and buffering capacity. What's the next common claim they tackle?
Claim 2, ERW has an altered water structure. This is the claim involving terms like microclustering, hexagonal water, or the idea that the water molecules are somehow smaller or arranged differently, which supposedly leads to increased cellular hydration or improved bioavailability.
Yes, the microclustered water idea. Seems very persistent. What does the review say about this?
The review dismisses this claim entirely, calling it pseudoscientific and contrary to fundamental chemistry and physics. They state plainly that water molecules in liquid form associate only very fleetingly through hydrogen bonds, forming constantly shifting networks, not stable microclusters or persistent hexagonal structures. The idea of smaller water molecules is also nonsensical from a chemical standpoint.
So basic chemistry says stable clusters don't really exist in liquid water.
Pretty much. Furthermore, they explain how water actually gets into our cells. It primarily enters through specific protein channels in the cell membrane called aquaporins. And water passes through these channels essentially one molecule at a time, in a linear fashion, not as preformed clusters.
Okay, so the way water enters cells doesn't support the cluster idea either. What about the demonstrations people use to prove microclustering, like making tea faster?
Right. They address those common demonstrations directly. Things like showing changes in nuclear magnetic resonance, NMR bandwidth, or the ability to make tea quickly with cold ERW, or how ERW sometimes appears to mix with oil. According to the review, these demonstrations are based on misinterpretations and are actually attributable entirely to the pH of the water, not some magical altered structure.
How does pH explain those demos?
Okay, for the NMR bandwidth. The review explains that the NMR signal properties of water are known to change with deviations in pH away from neutral, pH 7. So a change in the signal doesn't mean clusters, it just reflects the pH.
Makes sense. What about a cold tea trick?
The cold tea demonstration, they say, often works because many compounds in tea leaves are natural pH indicators.
Like litmus paper. They change color with pH.
Exactly. So when you put high pH water on them, the color changes or extracts differently simply because of a chemical reaction with the pH, making it look like the color is extracting faster or better. It's not because smaller water clusters are penetrating the tea leaves more effectively. It's just a pH effect on the tea compounds themselves.
Clever. Okay. And the oil mixing demo.
The apparent mixing of oil with high pH water isn't due to microclustering allowing them to mix. The review explains it's a basic chemical reaction called saponification.
Saponification, like making soap.
Precisely. The high pH, which means lots of hydroxide ions, OH, reacts with the fatty acids in the oil to actually form soap molecules right there in the mixture. Soap acts as an emulsifier, allowing the oil and water to mix, or appear to mix. It's not the water structure, it's chemistry.
Wow, okay. And the claim that ERW is absorbed faster in the body.
The review suggests this anecdotal claim is more likely due to the effect of high pH on the rate of gastric emptying, how quickly stuff leaves your stomach. High pH might speed that up, leading to a feeling of faster absorption, but again, not related to water structure.
That's a really thorough takedown of those common demonstrations, re-explaining them with pretty basic chemistry principles. Fascinating. Okay, what about Claim 3?
Claim 3. The negative ORP indicates the presence of free electrons, or stored energy in the water, that act as antioxidants by directly quenching free radicals. This ties into the idea that the ORP number itself represents some kind of magical antioxidant power source.
Right, the idea that there are loose electrons floating around in the water ready to zap free radicals. What's the review's counter to this?
The review states very clearly that the negative ORP measured in ERW is completely and exclusively explained by just two things: the presence of the dissolved molecular hydrogen gas, H2, and the water's high pH.
So just H2 and pH together create the negative ORP reading.
Yes. There are no free electrons floating around, nor is there any unusual stored energy involved beyond standard chemical potentials. They emphasize that ORP is just a measurement reflecting the balance of oxidizing and reducing substances present, and in ERW, that balance is dominated by the H2 and the OH concentration, which determines pH.
Okay.
They also add a caution. While a negative ORP can be associated with substances that have antioxidant potential, like H2 certainly does, having a negative ORP reading itself doesn't automatically guarantee safety or benefit. Many substances, some of them toxic, can create a negative ORP. It's not inherently good or bad, it just indicates a certain chemical potential.
Got it. So the negative ORP is simply a consequence of the H2 and the pH. It's not evidence of some mystical electron pool providing the benefit. Okay, what's Claim 4 they address?
Claim 4. ERW contains active atomic hydrogen, which is sometimes claimed to be the primary antioxidant species.
Atomic hydrogen, that's H with a dot, right?
Yeah.
A single hydrogen atom with an unpaired electron. That sounds like a free radical itself.
Yes, it absolutely is. And that's precisely the basis of the review's debunking of this claim. Atomic hydrogen, HI, is an extremely reactive radical.
So it wouldn't last long.
Exactly. If it were somehow generated in the water, it would instantly react, most likely with another H radical, to form stable molecular hydrogen, H2. The reaction H plus H2 is extremely fast. The review states that studies looking for atomic hydrogen in ERW have found no credible evidence of its existence in any meaningful amount or duration. They reiterate that molecular hydrogen, H2, alone is sufficient to explain any observed antioxidant effects.
Okay, so atomic hydrogen is just too unstable to be the active ingredient floating around in the water. Makes sense. What's the fifth claim they look at?
Claim 5. ERW contains beneficial mineral hydrides, or special mineral nanoclusters that are generated during the electrolysis process.
Mineral hydrides, nanoclusters. Are there tiny exotic mineral compounds being created?
The review says there is no credible scientific evidence to support this claim either. They explain that mineral hydrides, like calcium hydride or magnesium hydride, are generally highly reactive compounds, especially with water, and their stable existence in an aqueous solution like ERW is highly unlikely from a chemical standpoint.
Okay. What about nanoclusters?
Similarly, no good evidence. Furthermore, they point to the electrochemistry involved. During electrolysis at the cathode, where alkaline water forms, the process strongly favors the reduction of protons, H+, from water molecules to form H2 gas. Reducing dissolved mineral ions, like Sih2+ or Mg2+, to form hydrides or metallic nanoclusters would require significantly higher electrical voltages than what is typically used in commercial water electrolysis devices, especially in the high pH environment near the cathode, where the concentration of H+ ions is already low. The easier reaction, making H2, happens preferentially.
So the electricity primarily just makes H2 gas from the water at the cathode, doesn't have enough oomph under normal conditions to create these exotic mineral compounds.
That's the chemical argument presented in the review, yes.
Okay, so having systematically addressed and, in their view, debunked these 5 common claims, alkalizing pH, microclusters, free electrons ORP, atomic hydrogen, mineral hydrides, nanoclusters. The review then returns to its core finding, right, about the molecular hydrogen.
Exactly. They return to their central argument that molecular hydrogen, H2, is the exclusive therapeutic agent responsible for any genuine effects observed with ERW, and they provide evidence to support this claim.
What is that evidence they present? How do they make the case for H2 being the only active ingredient?
They highlight a critical line of evidence from other research, again, studies not in our specific stack, but part of the broader literature they reviewed. Numerous studies they report have specifically investigated the effects of using neutral pH hydrogen-rich water.
Neutral pH water, so regular pH 7 water, but with H2 gas dissolved into it.
Precisely. Water that has H2 gas added or dissolved in it, but does not have the high alkaline pH typically found in ERW. And the key finding: these studies showed that this neutral pH hydrogen-rich water produces the same antioxidant and therapeutic effects that have been observed and attributed to high pH ERW.
Ah, so if you get the same benefits without the high pH, it strongly suggests the pH itself isn't the active component.
That's exactly the conclusion they draw. It provides strong evidence that the alkaline pH is irrelevant to the actual therapeutic effects. They also cite specific experiments that further bolster this point.
Like what?
Experiments where researchers took high pH alkaline water, ERW, that normally showed beneficial effects, and they specifically removed the dissolved H2 gas from it while keeping the high pH. The result: the beneficial effects were completely abolished.
Removing the H2 eliminated the benefit, even though the pH was still high.
Correct. And conversely, they cite other experiments where researchers took H2-rich alkaline water, neutralized its pH back down to 7, so it was no longer alkaline but still contained the H2, and tested it. The result: neutralizing the pH had no impact on its therapeutic efficacy. The benefits remained as long as the H2 was present.
Wow. Okay, that combination of evidence-neutral water with H2 works. Removing H2 from alkaline water stops it working. Neutralizing pH of H2-rich water doesn't stop it working. Seems like a very powerful case for isolating H2 as the sole active component responsible for the effects.
It certainly seems to be the comprehensive case built by the authors of this review, yes, based on the scientific literature they examined.
How do they conclude the review? Any final thoughts or recommendations?
They concluded with a very practical caution, particularly regarding measurements. While a negative ORP reading does indicate the presence of dissolved H2 because H2 contributes significantly to negative ORP, they stress that ORP measurements cannot be used to accurately estimate or compare the actual concentration of H2 dissolved in the water.
Why not? If H2 causes negative ORP,
Because, as they explained, the ORP reading is heavily influenced by the water's pH as well. So, two water samples could have the same negative ORP but very different H2 concentrations if their pH levels are different. Or they could have different ORPs but the same H2 concentration. It's just not a reliable quantitative measure for H2 itself.
okay, so ORP tells you H2 is likely there, but not how much.
Exactly. Therefore, they strongly recommend that any future research on ERW or any product making claims about its effects should focus on and actually measure the concentration of dissolved molecular hydrogen using appropriate analytical methods, rather than relying solely on proxy measures like pH or ORP values.
These are the actual active ingredient, not just indicators. Makes sense.
Right. And they also ended with advice for consumers. Basically, be critical and wary of marketing claims for alkaline water that extend beyond the scientifically supported data, which, in their comprehensive view presented in this review, point solely to the effects of dissolved molecular hydrogen, H2.
Wow. Okay. That review article provides a fundamentally different lens through which to view all the claims and even the potential effects of alkaline water. It really shifts the focus dramatically away from pH and all those other popular concepts, landing squarely on dissolved molecular hydrogen.
It certainly does. It stands as a strong science-based counterpoint to many of the common ideas and marketing messages circulating about this type of water.
Okay, deep breath. We've now completed our deep dive into each of the 4 sources you sent us. We've looked at those studies suggesting potential positive effects in specific contexts, like faster blood viscosity recovery after exercise.
In the first study.
Improvements in markers of aging and antioxidant status in mice using that special supplemented water.
Right, the second source.
And those significant improvements in markers of oxidative stress, inflammation, blood glucose, and quality of life in humans with type 2 diabetes, especially when alkaline water was combined with walking.
The third source, showing that synergy.
And then we've thoroughly examined this 4th source, the scientific review article, that critically scrutinizes the underlying science and argues very strongly that if there are genuine benefits from ERW, they are solely due to the molecular hydrogen present, not the alkaline pH or any of those other popularly claimed mechanisms like microclustering or free electrons.
Exactly. So we have these pieces of potential evidence suggesting an effect from the first 3 studies, and then this very strong scientific argument from the review about the probable mechanism, or perhaps more accurately, what the mechanism isn't, pH, clusters, etc., and what it likely is, H2.
So let's try to pull all of this together. Based only on the information provided in this specific stack of sources we've just explored, what does this constellation of findings and perspectives mean for you, our listener? How do we connect these dots?
Okay, synthesizing from just these sources, here's the picture that emerges. On one hand, we have research, the first 3 sources, suggesting that interventions involving the consumption of alkaline water, sometimes with specific mineral additions, sometimes combined with exercise, are associated with potentially beneficial changes in certain specific physiological markers and patient-reported outcomes.
Right, we saw that in the viscosity study.
Pointing to faster viscosity recovery post-exercise.
The mouse aging study.
Showing improvements in antioxidant status, telomere markers, and cellularity, though with that crucial caveat about supplements.
And in the T2DM study.
Demonstrating reductions in inflammatory and oxidative stress markers, better fasting glucose control, and improved quality of life, especially with the synergistic effect of combining water and walking.
Okay, so that's one side. Studies showing associations with positive outcomes. And then the review article comes crashing in and says,
And then the review comes in and essentially says, hold on, okay. He might be observing some effects, but the reason for those effects is almost certainly not what you're often being told in marketing messages or popular explanations.
right.
The review presents a compelling case, drawing on fundamental chemistry principles and referring to other research, though not specifically analyzing the 3 studies in our stack, that the exclusive agent responsible for any observed therapeutic effects and also for the characteristic negative ORP is the dissolved molecular hydrogen, H2.
And it argues that the other explanations, the alkaline pH itself having direct effect, the microclustering, the free electrons, the atomic hydrogen, the mineral nanoclusters, are either scientifically baseless or are simply indicators of H2's presence rather than being the actual cause of the benefit themselves.
That's the core argument of the review, yes. It reframes H2 as the star player and demotes pH and the others to side notes or misconceptions.
Okay, so accepting that strong argument from the review for a moment, how might that proposed H2 mechanism potentially explain or connect with the positive associations seen in the other 3 studies? Can we draw plausible links, staying strictly within the concepts and connections mentioned within these 4 sources?
We can try to connect some dots based only on what's here. The review clearly identifies H2 as an antioxidant. Now let's look back.
Okay.
The viscosity study's own discussion section explicitly linked oxidative stress to impaired red blood cell function, rigidity, aggregation, and consequently increased blood viscosity. They themselves speculated that mitigating oxidative stress could improve blood flow.
Right. They brought up oxidative stress as a possible factor.
Exactly. So based on this connection within the viscosity source itself and combining it with the review's identification of H2 as an antioxidant, it becomes plausible to hypothesize that the H2's antioxidant properties might have helped protect the red blood cells or improve their function during rehydration in the ALK group, thereby contributing to the faster viscosity recovery they observed. The H2 could be the reason oxidative stress was potentially mitigated.
That fits together nicely, connecting the review's mechanism to the first study's speculation. What about the aging and diabetes studies?
Yeah.
Oxidative stress was huge there too.
Absolutely central. The mouse aging study directly measured oxidative stress markers like ROS, which went down, and the antioxidant enzymes SOD1 and GSH, which went up, in the group drinking the supplemented water.
Oh.
The T2DM study heavily focused on oxidative stress markers like AGEs, AOPPs, and MDA, and found significant reductions in all the intervention groups compared to control. So, if H2 acts as an antioxidant, as argued forcefully by the review, then its presence in the alkaline water consumed in those studies could very plausibly be the underlying reason for the observed improvements in these oxidative stress markers. The H2 could be neutralizing ROS, sparing the body's own antioxidants like SOD and GSH, and perhaps reducing the formation of damaged products like AGEs and AOPPs.
So the H2 mechanism from the review offers a direct potential explanation for the antioxidant effects seen in the other 2 studies.
It seems to provide a unifying potential mechanism, yes. The H2's antioxidant effect could also theoretically influence things like telomere maintenance or cellularity, as oxidative stress is known to contribute to aging processes, though the specific pathways linking H2 to telomeres aren't elaborated in these particular sources beyond that general connection.
And what about that really strong synergistic effect seen in the T2DM study when walking was combined with the alkaline water? Does the H2 explanation fit there too?
I think it fits quite well. Remember, the T2DM study's own discussion attributed the powerful combined effects specifically to synergistic antioxidant effects.
Right.
The review identifies H2, presumably present in the AEW, as an antioxidant. And the T2DM study's discussion also noted that walking itself is known to increase the body's own antioxidant enzymes. So the idea that combining two different interventions, one delivered via the water, H2, and one stimulated by the exercise, the body's enzymes, both of which match the body's overall antioxidant capacity, could result in a synergistic greater than additive effect seems entirely consistent. It aligns perfectly with the T2DM study's own interpretation and with the review's focus on H2 as an antioxidant molecule.
Okay, so if we weave together the information from just these four sources, we get a picture where some research indicates potential health improvements linked to drinking alkaline water, or treatments including it, like the supplemented water or water plus walking. And alongside that, a strong scientific argument is presented in the review suggesting that if such benefits are real, they are most likely due to the presence of dissolved molecular hydrogen acting as an antioxidant, rather than the water's alkalinity or other commonly claimed but scientifically questioned properties.
That seems to be the key synthesis emerging from this specific collection of materials, yes. It creates a tension between observed associations and the proposed underlying mechanism.
However, as we discuss while going through them, it's also really crucial to keep in mind the nuances and limitations presented within these sources themselves, right? It's not all perfectly straightforward.
Absolutely not. We need to remember those caveats. What were some of the key ones we flagged?
Well, first, the mouse aging study is a prime example. The alkaline water used there wasn't simple ERW. It was explicitly described as being supplemented with specific essential elements, boron, molybdenum, selenium, and specific salts from named sources.
Right, the Bolivian rose salt and all that.
Exactly. And the authors themselves acknowledged that these additions might have contributed to the observed effects on telomeres and antioxidants. This means we absolutely cannot attribute the findings from that specific study solely to the alkalinity or even just to potential H2 from electrolysis, because those added supplements are a major confounding factor.
A very important limitation for interpreting that study's results in the context of alkaline water generally.
Definitely. What else?
Another point came from the viscosity study. While they found that significant difference in the rate of recovery and the overall percent change in viscosity, they also honestly reported that the absolute differences between the ALK and CON groups at multiple discrete time points, like T30 or T120, were not statistically significant.
Right, the variability issue.
Yes. They speculated that high intersubject variability in the viscosity measurements might have masked differences at those specific snapshots in time. So while the trend was significant, the picture at any single moment was perhaps less clear-cut.
Okay, another nuance.
And then, perhaps most critically, stemming from the review article, is that crucial caution about measurement. The review strongly argues that H2 concentration is the key factor determining biological effects, but it also emphasizes that ORP is not a reliable or quantitative measure of H2 levels, mainly because ORP is so heavily influenced by pH.
Right. Measure the H2 directly, they said.
Exactly. But then, looking back at the excerpts provided from the other studies, the viscosity study and the T2DM study, the specific concentration of dissolved H2 in the alkaline water they used wasn't consistently mentioned or detailed. The T2DM study named the brand of AEW machine used, and the viscosity study named the brands of water tested, Essentia, Dasani. But the actual H2 concentration delivered wasn't reported in the parts we have.
So even if H2 is the active ingredient, we don't know from these sources how much H2 was actually present in the water used in the human trials that showed effects.
Precisely. This makes it challenging, based only on this stack of sources, to definitively correlate the observed effects in those studies directly with specific concentrations of molecular hydrogen. We have studies suggesting effects, but with potentially varying water compositions, especially the mouse study, and limitations in the details about the proposed active ingredient, H2. And we have a review that identifies the probable mechanism, H2, but highlights these very issues with how that active component is typically measured or reported, often relying on proxies like ORP or just pH.
Okay, so putting it all together, this deep dive, guided by these specific sources you sent us, really reveals a complex landscape. There's ongoing research exploring potential effects of alkaline water in different health contexts, hydration, aging, diabetes. But alongside that runs a strong, scientifically grounded debate and critique about the precise reason for any observed benefits. It really underscores that while the public conversation and a lot of marketing often focuses almost exclusively on alkalinity and other, sometimes dubious claims,
Right, the high pH, the clusters.
the scientific discussion, at least as presented forcefully in one of these key sources, points much more towards the dissolved molecular hydrogen, H2, as the likely and perhaps only active player.
It certainly complicates the simple drink high pH water for health message that's often heard, doesn't it?
It really does. It strongly suggests that simply having a high pH number might not be the relevant part of the story at all. Instead, the presence and, crucially, the concentration of dissolved hydrogen gas might be what truly matters, assuming the benefits discussed in some of these studies are indeed real and attributable to the water treatment itself.
A completely different focus.
This has been a genuinely insightful look at what these particular sources tell us, and also what they don't tell us about alkaline water. We've explored potential impacts on human performance via viscosity, looked at markers related to aging in mice, examined metabolic health and diabetes, and all the while we've had to grapple with this critical scientific perspective from the review that fundamentally challenges the common narrative about why any of these effects might occur.
Yes, we've navigated through human trials and mouse studies, delved into specific biochemical markers like MDA and AGEs, looked at telomere length and quality of life measurements, and critically examined the fundamental chemistry and physics behind the popular claims, all guided by that important review article questioning the standard explanations.
It definitely leaves you, the listener, with a lot to think about. And perhaps a final provocative thought to leave you with, based purely on synthesizing these sources. Considering how much of the public discourse and the marketing around alkaline water has revolved almost entirely around its high pH value and other properties like microclustering, what might it really mean for our understanding if the scientific evidence, as presented so strongly in that review article, suggests the real story isn't about pH at all, but is actually about tiny, invisible molecules of molecular hydrogen dissolved in the water? How does shifting our focus from pH to H2 potentially change how we interpret the findings in studies like the ones we've discussed today, and maybe how we should think about this type of water and the claims made about it moving forward?
It certainly reframes the entire discussion, doesn't it? It urges a much more precise scientific focus on H2 concentration and its specific biological effects.
Indeed. Definitely something worth pondering the next time you encounter information about alkaline water. That's all the time we have for this deep dive into your source material. Thanks so much for exploring this complex and sometimes contradictory topic with us.
Always a pleasure to unpack the science, especially when it challenges common assumptions.